I just want to welcome everyone to our first ever Elementary Inquiry Institute. First of hopefully many. I want to thank you all for taking the time to be here. I know there is quite a bit of virtual conference overload, and I really appreciate you all being here and being engaged in the work that we're doing. I want to also thank, as Martin did, our partners at NCSS. They are amazing partners, and specifically Ashante Horton has really done some great groundwork to get the word out about this conference. I want to thank a few members of our team, specifically Jeanette Hardy-Baum, who really makes sure that you all get the emails and the communication you need about things like this. Ashley Idbo, who's here, who really has taken on a lot of the logistics. And then really a special shout out to Martin Andrews, who you all just heard from, and I'm sure many of you know from our webinar series, who really has been the driving force behind the Elementary Inquiry Institute. So thank you to all of them. Thank you to all of our folks on the Inquire Ed team that are presenting, and thanks for you all being here. So I'm going to jump right in from here. And as Martin mentioned, please feel free to throw questions in the chat as I'm talking. I will make sure to keep some time at the end for questions. But feel free to throw them in as you're coming to you, and then I can come back and revisit them at the end. So my title of my presentation is Moving Beyond Polarization. And lately I've been having a bit of a chicken or the egg moment, right? So all of us are seeing everything that's coming out about critical race theory. It seems to be all around us. And I've really been having this chicken or the egg moment where I'm like, which one came first? So is it that the media and honestly some trolling happening that caused the hype? Or is it that there was really controversy at the classroom level, at the school level, at the district level? Which one of these comes first? And I'm going to be honest here and say that I have a very strong opinion that I think the media hype, I think the trolling and things like that came first. And now we're seeing that really bring some controversy to the district, to the school, to the classroom, to what you all are on the front lines of dealing with every day. And so I've also had this realization that I can be obsessed with which one came first, but I really got to ask myself, does it really matter? Because here we are in this moment. Now, I'm going to put a pin in this, does it really matter? Because I think there's some lessons learned for us as educators about this idea of what comes first, but I'm going to come back to that later in my presentation. So for now, I'm going to say, you know what, here we are in this moment. So I was curious, how much hype is there out there? Is it that I'm just in social studies and so I hear about this all day long, or is it really hyped? And so I did a quick Google search on this on Google News to see how many hits I could get over the last, how many times CRT was mentioned in the last 30 days. And I got 10,300,000 hits. I got to tell you, as the founder of a social studies company, when I was starting Inquire Ed, most of my friends, my family members, and fellow educators were like, social studies? Really? Like, does anybody pay attention to social studies anymore? And so this number of 10,300,000 is actually pretty surprising. Now, it's not the kind of attention I want social studies getting, but it is attention. And so I really have to think about, like, what is the reality of what's happening and what's going on out there. Meanwhile, not surprising to anyone here at the Elementary Inquiry Institute, social studies has taken a backseat. And I'm not talking like, a little bit of a backseat. I'm talking like econo van situation of we're way in the back compared to ELA, math, and science. And this, this study on elementary instructional minutes given to elementary social studies comes from the Fordham Institute. And I got to say, 28 minutes a day, it is very rare that I talk to a school or a district that's allocating 28 minutes a day for social studies. So that even that number, I think, has a bit of a reporting inflation within it, and makes me wonder how much that is actually happening. So we all know, whatever the number is, elementary social studies has really taken a backseat. So where does this leave us as people who care about elementary social studies, who care about social studies in general, care about ensuring that our students have the skills and knowledge that we know that they need to have, both for today and for the future? And so all of you, I'm going to assume you're here at the Elementary Inquiry Institute, so you care, right? So where does this leave us? The good news is that in the social studies community, so let's just ignore for a little bit all of the hype, all of the politics, all of the politicians coming in to our space and telling us what to do. Let's ignore all of that when they don't really know that much about what's actually happening in a classroom. And let's say those of us in social studies actually have a common goal, that we actually all pretty much agree that inquiry is our guiding light, that that's what social studies needs to look like. For those of you who aren't familiar, the C3 framework came out about almost 10 years ago now, and really set the groundwork for moving social studies to a more scientific, inquiry-based approach. The Educating for American Democracy Roadmap, which came out earlier this year, really builds on the work of C3 and further emphasizes an inquiry-based approach to this work. And so we all agree, the National Council for Social Studies agrees, all of the major bodies in social studies really agree that inquiry is our way forward. And so this really gives us a great destination, right? We know where we're going. We know what we want it to look like. Inquiry-based social studies is that destination for us. But the truth of the matter is, and this is probably why you all are here, is that inquiry is a major shift in instruction. So when I was an instructional coach, when I was a teacher in the classroom, I had been pretty inquiry-based. But when I moved into the role of an instructional coach, I realized that many of the teachers that I was supporting didn't grow up learning this way, and their teacher prep programs hadn't prepared them for this. They'd actually prepared them for a lot of ELA and math, or the pretty traditional learning model, but not an inquiry-based model. And so we've got some serious barriers along the route and not a lot of tools for teachers to be able to move to an inquiry-based model. Now, let's add some politics to the mix. And it's basically the equivalent of laying landmines along this very already difficult road to travel and saying, boom, you stepped in the wrong spot. Here's a landmine that you're going to hit, or here's another landmine that you're going to hit. And so we've really complicated this journey for each and every one of you that are on the front lines of this. And what do we give you as gear for this journey? Well, let's take a look. Basically nothing. We say, teachers, let you go find your own resources, go figure it out. Oh, and then by the way, when you get it wrong, you're going to get blamed for it. Or we give you a textbook model that's outdated, that is not culturally relevant, and even oftentimes is factually inaccurate. And we say, oh, go use this with students. Or sometimes if your district leads who are really trying their best often say, hey, we got to give teachers something, they'll come up with a curricular framework. But you're still left to find the sources, create the learning experiences, and design everything around that, which is a huge load to take on. And so really, you don't have much gear for this journey that was already difficult before we added the politics into the mix. And when you're on a scary road by yourself without any gear to protect you, I'm pretty sure you don't think about all the things that could go right? You think about the boogeyman. You think about what could possibly go wrong because you don't have what you need to go on that journey. Right? You think about what might happen to me. And so many teachers just say, forget that. Forget social studies. Why am I going to even bother? It's just going to put me in hot water. Of course, we see instructional time not ticking up. You think about things like this. You think about how one teacher's Black Lives Matter lesson divided a small Wisconsin town and parents were coming in saying that the teacher should be fired. You think about that moment and what that would feel like as a teacher. As a teacher who thinks all day about what's best for their students, as a teacher who thinks all night about what's best for your students. I was a classroom teacher. I know it's an all-consuming job. And so the worst feeling could be someone coming in saying that you aren't putting your students first in what you're doing in the classroom. And by the way, who wants to get fired over this? Not anyone. But I want to return to that idea of, does it really matter, of this 10,300,000 hits that I saw, this idea of which came first, the hype or the actual what's happening in classrooms and schools and districts. And I got to tell you, when I looked at those 10,300,000 hits, it was pretty hard to find examples of individual teachers being disciplined. Now, I did not look, I promise, at every 10 million hit. So I'm going to tell you, this is based off of a pretty crude, findings and looking through and trying to find, but I had to search pretty hard. I actually had to ask some other people to find that example that I just showed you. And so I want to say to us, not that we should not be worried. I'm not in any way saying that there is nothing to worry about here, that the truth of the matter is there is controversy occurring, that the debate has gone from politics to school districts. And that's really unfortunate, because it's that politics wasn't about what's really best for students. If you ask me, it was about clickbait, about what we can get clicks on. But now the debate's gone from there to community members who do have the best intent for their students. And whether we agree or disagree, community members, they care about their students, the students that they're putting in their schools. And so this debate is real and live now. And so I'm not saying that there's nothing to worry about, but I am saying that we as educators have to continue to be bold, that we have to continue to think about what is best for our students, putting what is in saying, I know that what matters is my students being able to have a critical lens, my students making informed decisions, that when my students go out there and they're searching the web, that I've built the media literacy skills they need to be able to navigate that. That when they go into a voting booth, they're making informed decisions, that when they're going into their communities, they understand why something may be and what the effects of that might be on their lives. That all of these things are so important and so incredibly valuable for not just the life that our students might be living 20 years from now, but the life that they are living today. And so I'm not only telling you to be bold, I'm also saying that we need to give you some gear for this journey. And so I'm hoping that things like the Elementary Inquiry Institute give you some gear to really gear up for this journey. But I'm also going to give you a couple tips before I leave you today to go on offense with inquiry. So those of you who are from Chicago Public Schools, you may have heard this quote, go on offense with inquiry. It was in Education Week from a CPS teacher, Ashley McCall. And I got to tell you, it's become literally my mantra every day of go on offense with inquiry. I love this line, and it could not be more true. When something is coming at you, we can go back and say, forget it, I'm not going down that road, or we can go on offense. And I believe very strongly that inquiry is that thing for us. Now, obviously, I started a company named Inquire Ed, and if I had a tattoo, it would say inquiry. So take it with a grain of salt if you need to. But I really believe strongly that it's not just what is best for teachers to be teaching, but it's what's best for students and for what is best for them to be engaged in the classroom. So let's think about going on offense with inquiry. So there's 4 things I'm going to talk about: advocating for curricular support, being proactive about defining inquiry, evaluating your own practice, and talking about the why. All right, let's talk first about advocating for curricular support. So are you saying you want me to ask for a textbook? I got to tell you that when I was an individual teacher in the classroom, I really kind of saw instructional materials curriculum kind of like the devil. I really felt like it was taking away my ownership as a teacher. It was taking away my expertise of who my students are and really helping me build a community that valued and incorporated the lived and historical experiences of the specific students in my classroom. And so it really took away that autonomy and really the contextualization that's needed for social studies instruction. And so, no, I'm not asking you to ask for a textbook. I have serious problems with the textbook model, even when that textbook says that they've moved to a digital model, but really what they've done is just taken their textbook and put it in some PDFs or some fancy digital tools on a web page. I have real problems with that. That's a whole other keynote that I can talk about at another time, but no, I'm not asking you to ask for a textbook. What I am asking you to do, and I'm asking curriculum directors that are on this, is to really think about asking more of your curriculum before you ask more of your teachers. Elizabeth Bentley Simon, who's my co-founder and leads our learning experience team, often says this, and I have to say I love this one. This is another one of my daily mantras that I think about, is that we often say when things are going wrong in the classroom, when there's this controversy, a lot of the blame or a lot of the risk lies on the shoulders of teachers, on the individual teachers. And if we're going to ask teachers to really move to an inquiry-based model, if we're going to ask teachers to be able to think about multiple sources from multiple perspectives, to really think about the bias within sources and scaffolding learning experiences for students to examine that bias, to be building media literacy skills across the web pages, all of those things that we know are so important, building background knowledge in across subject areas, all of these things, we got to ask more of our curriculum. We can't stick with this old archaic textbook model that was meant for a world way before we had access to so much knowledge at our fingertips, in our back pockets. And so we got to ask more of our curriculum before we ask more of our teachers. So I know we have a mostly teacher audience here, but first of all, curriculum directors and instructional coaches, go ask more of your curriculum before you ask more of your teachers. And teachers, please advocate, and then when your district gives it to you, use high quality instructional materials. And what I mean by high quality instructional materials are really materials that support teachers in implementing an inquiry-based model in social studies. And so if you're interested in learning more about what high quality instructional materials look like, you can take a look at our social studies curriculum review guide. I think somebody just put the link in the chat. I won't spend too much time on it, but it really gives you some great resources to think about what high quality instructional materials should look like right now in the moment in time that we're in social studies. Second thing I want to talk about is being proactive about defining inquiry. So just as many of us did not grow up learning in an inquiry-based model, most of the family members that we have, community members that we have in our school communities did not grow up learning an inquiry-based model either. They don't know what inquiry-based learning is. And what I believe very strongly about human nature is when we don't understand something, we get scared of it. We say, okay, that must be something bad. I don't understand it. I don't understand why we can't just use a textbook. I don't understand why we don't just lecture and tell my students about, the battle of so-and-so. What was wrong with that? I don't understand. That's what worked for me. And so we've got to be proactive as educators at the beginning of the year and throughout about really saying, what are we doing? So that people don't come in and are assuming something that it isn't. And so really, honestly, this boils down to social studies as a branding issue. Right? It's not just what the politics are. Let's put all that aside for a second. Social studies has always had a branding issue. People often think of it as like ELA, math, and science are the real subjects. Social studies has this idea of kind of craft projects, scissors and glue without much knowledge in it. It lacks rigor. Everyone gets an A. And you add politics to that, and it's a serious branding issue, right? So we've got to get ahead of all of this branding issue and really say to people, this is what social studies is. It has rigor, and here's what it can look like, what it is when it does. That inquiry is a scientific approach to teaching social studies. That we're not just making things up and winging it based on, indoctrinating students as we feel like, every day. We're really taking a scientific approach to teaching social studies. And what that means is that inquiry always starts with questions, not conclusions. So much of the controversy out there is this assumption that we're going into classrooms and we're starting with conclusions. That's not what inquiry is happening. And I'm not saying that it's never happening, but that's not what a true inquiry-based approach is. That inquiry starts with questions, and that those questions drive the investigation. And then the teacher's role is to facilitate the investigation of sources. I was talking to one of our team members yesterday, and he said, Chris Olson, who's a former comes from the social science department in Chicago Public Schools, and he said in CPS they would often talk about you're not designing the sources, you're designing the learning experiences, right? So the whole teacher's job is to facilitate that investigation of sources, and those sources need to come from multiple perspectives, multiple publishers, multiple spaces. And that's my real problem with textbooks, which I told you I wouldn't go too much into, but there's this single source of knowledge. But the teachers are facilitating that deep investigation, that you're not going at this kind of surface level, that you're going deep and students are building this really deep knowledge. And then using that deep knowledge, students are using evidence to draw conclusions. And I want to emphasize two words there: students, conclusions. Those are the two key words that we got to make sure that we're really thinking about, that the students, and there's actually a third word, use evidence, that we're not just drawing conclusions, whether it's students or teachers, without the evidence, that students use that evidence to draw conclusions. And so really breaking that down for family members, community members, and really talking about it at the beginning of the year before they even make assumptions about what you're doing in the classroom. Going on offense with inquiry. So number 3 is what I want to talk about, is evaluate your practice. So this is kind of really thinking about what I just talked about students drawing their own conclusions. I think sometimes as educators, it's easy to go over the line. And I think it's important that we as educators always evaluate our own practice. And so I'm often asking our learning experience team, and I'm often asking myself when we talk about our curricular materials, am I drawing the conclusion for students, or am I supporting them to draw their own? And this is hard. I got to tell you that as a classroom teacher, I cross this line all the time. I was thinking about an example yesterday, and I was thinking, like, when was a clear moment where I crossed the line? And remember I was doing some case studies of revolutions, and we were looking at the American Revolution and then a few nonviolent movements, including the Indian independence movement. And obviously, I've got some bias towards in India, just based on my own demographics, and probably, I'm somebody who leans toward nonviolence. And I've definitely crossed the line of making a values judgment on, and really saying that to my students about that the nonviolent way of doing things was better. And I remember a student, really pushing me and saying, well, why? What makes it better? And so I think it's really important to be asking ourselves, where are we bringing those values judgments in? And when am I supporting students in drawing their own, or versus when am I drawing the conclusion for students? Now, that said, let's be super honest. The line here is not always clear. It is definitely not clear of what's the difference between a conclusion and a fact. This is hard, and it's hard to tease out that it's not as easy. If that example of what I just gave you about making a values judgment, that one's a little easier. I was making a values judgment on which is better, but sometimes it's not like that, right? Sometimes it's much, much, much more murky. And so I think as educators, when it's murky, and it often is, we've got to consider what's the best pedagogical path to drawing the conclusion. So let me give you an example. So if I'm talking about climate change with my students, there's really 2 pedagogical paths to my students thinking about climate change. One, there is me telling them and giving them one source that says, okay, climate change is real. Here it is. This is what it is. And done. We're done talking about it. The other pedagogical path is for me to put multiple pieces of evidence in front of students, heat maps, interviews with scientists, lots of different perspectives on what's happening and what people are saying about climate change, and then having them draw their own conclusion here. Now, I'm not saying that I never say, like, climate change and this is what scientists say about it. That is very much incorporated into it. But I think we've got to always ask ourselves, whether we're talking about climate change or equity issues or any of these things, what's the best pedagogical path to ensuring that that conclusion that students are drawing is sticky? And again, I know what I know about human nature, what I believe very strongly about human nature, is that when we're told something, we don't really like it that much. But when we see the evidence, when we're able to unpack that and really get into it, that's when the conclusions are sticky. That's when we really understand something and can unpack it. And then that's when it stays with us throughout our lives. And we can apply that criticality that we have to other things in our lives. And so we've really got to ask ourselves, what's the best pedagogical path to drawing conclusions for students? And I think it's inquiry. What I want to end with here today is talking about the why. So you've heard me talk a little bit about the why of inquiry. And I think this is, again, going back to being proactive about defining inquiry with your community members. This is another area that you can be proactive with. You can be proactive with your community members about thinking about why inquiry. Why are we talking about this? Let's not assume that people are on the same page here. And I could wax poetic, as you've heard me talk for a while now, about why inquiry matters. I could tell you for a long time why it matters. But I would rather hear from all of you. You've heard me talk about it. I could talk about my kids and what I want for them and all those things, but I'd rather hear from you. So tell me in the chat, why inquiry? Why are you here? Why does inquiry matter? And I'm going to set off some music for us while we're doing that. So much more engaging and relevant to students. Textbooks are terrible. It's one narrative and is not what historians do. Inquiry matters because it leads to deeper learning. It allows for students' interest and engagement. authentic learning, self-differentiating, research and problem solving. Students take ownership. Inquiry matters because it empowers students to think for themselves. Think for themselves, think for themselves. See that over and over. More ways to challenge my students. Investment. Overload of information, 21st century skills are a must. Multiple perspectives and self-discovery. Passion. Thank you, Megan. Passion matters. Students learn to be critical consumers of information and practice taking action. Personal connection. Teaches critical thinking skills as citizens of democracy are necessary. Gain better understanding through discussion. Research and come up with their own perspectives, ideas, and discuss, argue their points. Give folks a few more minutes to do that. As you're doing that, I'd also love if you have any questions to add those to the chat or to the Q&A, and I can take those. And turn my screen off. And take any questions. I did see one just now that I'll take, and then Martin, if you can come back and still take any questions that you saw come in. I want to just take a second. I saw someone chat, you know, I've always wanted to do inquiry, but I don't know where to start. And I think I hear you. I want to be really clear in that saying that inquiry is hard. It is not an easy way to teach. And again, it really takes support. And I believe really strongly, and I told you, you know, I kind of saw instructional materials as like, what, you know, no, you know, I don't want them when I was in the classroom. And I've really turned my head. I started a company that develops instructional materials. And so I believe really strongly that you all need support, that this is a really tough journey. And so you need support in this, like the elementary inquiries too, and much more. And so I will never say that it's easy, but I believe it's worth the journey very strongly for all the reasons that all of you are saying. Hi, Martin.
Hey, how's it going? You know,
Good.
I do have some questions from our attendees that I want to ask, and then I actually want to begin though just asking you the question about back when you were a classroom teacher and then you moved through to be an instructional coach and now leading Inquire Ed for 3 years. So much of my experience as a social studies teacher was being overwhelmed and creating what I needed to do to stay afloat, really. And it seems like a blur those first years of my teaching experience. If you could really go back to talk to you as a first year, second year, third year teacher, what would be the piece of advice you would give?
Yeah, I think one of the things I hit on earlier was the idea of where I'm drawing conclusions for my students versus where I'm really thinking about the best pedagogical path. I think that even just as a leader of an organization, when I think about human behavior, that's been a real thing that I've really come to understand, that inquiry isn't just in the classroom, that inquiry goes beyond. You know, I had a parent who said to me once, you got to throw the New Yorker out of you, because I had come from New York to the classroom I was in. And at the time, I got to tell you, I was pretty upset about what she said. But looking back, there were some moments where I probably went a little far. And so I think that's the thing, is that it's not that I want I'm not saying that I would want the conclusion to be different for my students in terms of equity, in terms of social justice, all of those pieces. But I think sometimes I was trying to spoon feed it to my students, that conclusion that I wanted them to get to, and really allowing them to get there. I think I did it sometimes, but then there were sometimes where I would cross that line. I think the other thing is, I think I was selfish when I was in the classroom. I think I thought specifically about the students in my classroom and what was best for them, which was exactly what I should have been doing as an individual classroom teacher. That was my job, to put them first beyond anything else. And what I wasn't really thinking as much about is the vertical integration of experiences. So, you know, that path that I showed you, the end point isn't actually at the end of, you know, 5th grade when I was done teaching. It's actually way far away from anything that I can even see. And so what I've got to think about as a teacher is the collective effort that we as educators are coming into, that we as curriculum companies, that you as educators, as professional development providers, instructional leads, all of these things coming together and say, how do we as a family be better at this and playing different roles in this work? And so what I've come to realize about instructional materials is, I was sometimes doing, let's do a map study because I love maps. And meanwhile, the teacher before me was doing a map study too. And I wasn't really thinking about the vertical integration of those skills. I was also not really, and I will be honest, it's been a while since I'm in the classroom, and disinformation and misinformation has increased exponentially since I was in the classroom, but I'm not sure how much I had the time to deeply vet sources in the way that our learning experience team does. And they will tell you that they don't have enough time. So I think I've also come to realize that like teachers need support in this, that going it alone, kind of the superhero teacher myth doesn't make sense. And that we really all got to think about the different roles that everyone can play in this work.
Yeah, there's a question from Michael that really gets a little bit at that idea that there is a tension between the need to honor student voice and choice in an inquiry, encourage and prompt students to generate questions and explore challenges and solutions, but also to cover the standards, to hit the things that you need to hit.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that tension? And it sounds like maybe it's a necessary tension in a way.
Yeah. Now, let me first say, I'll be honest. I've got some. There's some standards that I'd love to cross out. A lot of team members on our team call them fact nugget standards, where you've got one person's individually and one specific battle mentioned. And I'd love to, go through and be able to cross all of those out. That said, and there's some serious bias, I also think, in where those standards have come from. So that said, I actually don't think there's an either or in the standards. I think we can think about, so if I think about something like covering, I'll use the American Revolution because I talked about it earlier. I can think about, okay, well, the standards say that they want my students to build background and knowledge in the American Revolution. And I can think about how I develop that in an inquiry-based way. Again, there's one way to teach that content. I can stand at the front of the room and I can lecture you about what the American Revolution is, or I can really think about how does this relate to my students' modern day context? And I can think about developing inquiry questions that are open-ended that really help students relate that work to their modern day context. And I can think about developing opportunities within that where students are bringing their lived and historical experiences because I've connected it to modern day context. So the American Revolution, I'd like to tell you, is still like, we got lots of debate. We still have people who are taxed without representation. There are plenty of people. And so that's something that we can talk about as a current modern day thing that students can connect to things that have happened in the past. We can bring that in. Informed action is also a key place to think about where students' voice comes in and their lived experiences. So if I decide ahead of time, well, everybody's doing a 5-paragraph essay, that's not informed action. My student voice can't be really a part of that. But if I'm having my students really think about it, I encourage you to go to the informed action session that really talks about how you can do this with an inquiry challenge statement. Is you can really think about how do my students decide what audience I'm affecting, what they're doing, how they're doing it, and what it's going to look like. And that really helps bring in that student voice and choice all along the way. I think sources are another place where teachers can really think about who are my students and their lived historical experiences, and what are mirrors and windows. So how am I thinking about the demographics of my classroom, and where am I bringing in sources that bring in mirrors and bring in windows? And I think there's a session by Elizabeth Bentling-Simon on source selection. I'm really thinking about mirrors and windows. So hopefully better answers at people who really know what they're talking about in those sessions.
Yeah, well, I think that actually is a really great setup specifically too for the sessions today. We'll follow this session with and principles and practices, an overview that goes a little deeper than what Shanti has talked about inquiry in this keynote. But then the very next session is Emery Lucas, and she is talking about how to both promote and honor student-generated questions and hit the standards that you need to hit. So it's a great session to talk specifically about that. And then, tomorrow's the sources and informed action. So we're really going to hit on those things throughout the Institute. And I'm excited about that. We had a comment from Rachel. I also wish there was more of an effort in general to integrate ELA into social studies rather than the other way around.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Rachel. And I will tell you, don't tell anybody else, but that's the dream. We already do quite a bit of integration of ELA into social studies, but I think we could go even further, and I think that's where we'll eventually head. But I agree completely. We often think about, there's a lot of content-based literacy programs out there, and literacy programs that are content-based and that bring content in, but I want to think about content-based literacy, right? So when we think about really what the research says about literacy skills is actually that students need content. They need to build background knowledge in order to really get to those higher levels of literacy skills that we want them to get to. And I believe that starts with subject areas like the social studies, and saying that having that deep knowledge there and then putting those ELA skills into it rather than the other way around. Because what happens when we go the other way around is we kind of hit on this subject over here. Today we're talking about, I keep talking about the American Revolution. I don't know why that topic got in my head. Tomorrow we're talking about meeting needs and wants and things like that. We're talking about different things, and we never really go deep and build that background knowledge which helps both in the social studies in terms of really thinking about sustained investigation and informed action, but also in terms of literacy skills and building deep background knowledge and getting to those higher literacy skills. So I couldn't agree more, Rachel. And I think we do it quite a bit in our content, but I think there's even more to go there.
Yeah, so I'm going to ask a couple more questions. What would be, the question would be instructional time for the social studies, and what it takes a teacher to use an inquiry-based approach,
Yeah, I think this really relates to Rachel's question. And we see it with some inquiry journeys teachers. They'll take the inquiry curriculum that we provide that's meant to be a core social studies curriculum, and they'll really build out their ELA from there, because their district has said you've got 90 minutes for ELA and you've got 30 minutes maybe if you're lucky for social studies. And the truth of the matter is it's really difficult to do inquiry-based learning in 30 minutes, maybe a couple times a week. And so they'll really think about look at all of the ELA skills that I'm hitting on here. I can take some of my ELA time to be able to do this, and not being so rigid about that and really going across the board and saying, hey, I'm hitting on ELA here. And so they do that. I think the other thing is to really honestly advocate. I think we've got to push districts to say this matters. There's so much research that says if people really don't care, when I can't imagine not caring about social studies skills, but I know there are people out there that don't think it matters, that take the research-based approach with literacy. Tell your curriculum directors, tell your superintendents, assistant superintendents, have you seen the research about how we increase literacy skills? It's through content areas like social studies. Martin, if you don't mind, if you have the link handy, can we shoot that Fordham study out? It's a really key piece of research that's out there that says this is critical to students improving literacy skills. And so I really encourage you to go advocate for more instructional time. I don't have a way of saying you've got 15 minutes a week and you can be inquiry-based in social studies. I wish I had a magic wand to make that work, but I don't.
Yeah, we had a question, and I'll share that link here in a second. We had a question in the Q&A. Sumira is the social studies chair in her district, and starting from scratch, transforming the old way of instruction using textbooks or teacher-made worksheets, transforming from that. She asks for, it's a huge task, and she asks for first steps.
Yeah. I don't have an easy answer here either, Samara. Thanks for your question. Part of the reason I started Inquire Ed was really out of this exact thing, not part of the reason, basically the entire reason. I saw a lot of professional development type things that came in and said, okay, here's what inquiry is. And I'm going to tell you what it is. I'm going to tell you why it matters. And I'm going to tell you how to go design your own inquiries. And then you're going to go into the classroom tomorrow and you're going to go both design your own inquiries, write your own curriculum, and you're going to shift your entire instructional practice. And Martin used this analogy. I like this analogy as well. It's like going to your first piano lesson and asking the person to write and play the music at that first lesson. It does not work. I believe really strongly the professional development has a place in this work, but it cannot be the whole thing. So I really think, in thinking about this, I've thought about people need to see what it is, and so they need to understand it. So some of the best ways to do this is by having inquiry-based experiences for teachers. How do they best learn, right? Really asking them what's worked for them in their past when they were students, what's worked for them as adults, giving them opportunities to learn in an inquiry-based way about inquiry, giving them opportunities to have instructional materials that show them the path. I'll tell you, with our content, often teachers in that first unit, we get a lot of reservations, Our partner experience team often shows this kind of graph of anxiety, like excitement and then anxiety in that first unit. And I think that's true and real, right? It's hard and that as you're getting into it, but if you've got something in front of you that gives you a path, now you can get past that thing. You get past that first day of just being sore at the gym. And now you're actually like feeling the adrenaline of it. You're feeling the endorphins, the excitement of what it can be as you move into that second unit. So I think tools are really a huge part of this. And that's why I say it's not an easy answer. I don't have a way of just waving a wand again and saying, teachers, now you get it. Now you didn't grow up this way, but now you understand that this is valuable. I really do think we've got to help support teachers with models that help them really understand what this can look like in the classroom, rather than just asking them to go figure it out.